For nearly 48 hours, something didn't add up, and the silence at the top of Israel's leadership was louder than any missile strike. At the exact moment when the country faced one of the most intense waves of attacks in its modern history, when every system was under pressure and every decision carried strategic consequences, the one person expected to lead from the front simply wasn't there. An emergency war cabinet meeting was called. The stakes could not have been higher. Yet the chair reserved for the Prime Minister remained empty. And what happened next raised a question that still has not been fully answered. Who was actually in control? The meeting went ahead without him. Not delayed, not rescheduled, not canceled. Just carried on as if the absence of the country's top decision maker was somehow manageable. The defense minister stepped in, formally declaring the prime minister absent and assuming control of the session. This was not routine. This was not procedural flexibility. This was the room where Israel's immediate response to a coordinated and escalating Iranian offensive was being determined, and the leader who had initiated the broader confrontation was nowhere to be seen. What makes this moment even more striking is not speculation or rumor, but confirmation. Israeli media outlets with direct access to internal government processes reported the absence as fact. There was no ambiguity about whether the meeting happened. There was no dispute about who attended. The anomaly was simple and undeniable. The Prime Minister did not appear, and no official explanation was offered at the time. In a system built around rapid centralized decision-making during wartime, that kind of gap is not just unusual, it's structurally significant. To understand why this matters, it's important to separate what is known from what remains uncertain. What is known is straightforward. The meeting occurred. The Prime Minister was not present. The Defense Minister took over. These are documented points confirmed through multiple credible channels. But almost immediately, a second layer of narrative began to form, one driven not by confirmed data, but by competing interpretations and rapidly spreading claims. Regional media networks, particularly those aligned with Iran, moved quickly to suggest that the absence was not voluntary. Reports began circulating that a high-level Israeli location had been targeted in a strike that may have had deeper implications than publicly acknowledged. Some outlets described the incident as a direct hit on leadership infrastructure. At the same time, Western outlets pushed back, stating that the Prime Minister was alive and operational, though they stopped short of providing detailed explanations for his absence. This left a gap, an information space where two entirely different interpretations could exist side by side. And in a conflict environment where perception often shapes reality as much as facts do, that gap became the focal point of global attention. Then another piece of the puzzle emerged, one that added complexity rather than clarity. A journalist was arrested shortly after broadcasting live from what appeared to be a sensitive location. During the broadcast, the journalist identified a high-profile figure on camera, suggesting that the Prime Minister was present at that site. Within a short window of time, a strike was reported in the same area. Authorities moved quickly, detaining the journalist on grounds of exposing national security information. The arrest itself is confirmed. What remains unclear is the exact sequence of events that followed the broadcast. Did the live transmission reveal coordinates that were then used in targeting? Was the strike already planned and the timing coincidental? Or was the connection between the two events more direct? These questions remain unresolved, but the speed and seriousness of the response indicate that security services treated the situation as more than just a minor breach. While these questions circulated, the public-facing response from the government took an unexpected form. Instead of a formal address, instead of a press conference, or a statement delivered from a recognizable command environment, brief video clips began to appear. One showed the Prime Minister partially visible behind a curtain in an undisclosed location. Another depicted a casual setting that resembled a cafe. Both clips were quickly scrutinized, with viewers pointing out visual inconsistencies and unusual details. Independent fact-checkers examined the footage and concluded that the videos were authentic, attributing the anomalies to technical factors like compression and lighting. But the deeper issue was not whether the footage was real. The question was why this was the method of communication being used at all. In every previous crisis, the pattern had been consistent: direct, controlled appearances designed to project authority and stability. This time the approach was different, and that difference became a data point in itself. At the same moment, the conflict on the ground was entering a new phase. Iran announced the launch of a new wave of operations, one that differed from previous attacks in both scale and intent. This was not just another round of strikes targeting infrastructure. This was a shift towards something more precise and more strategic, an effort to disrupt the systems that coordinate military action rather than just the assets themselves. The timing of this escalation, combined with the uncertainty surrounding leadership visibility, created a situation where multiple variables were moving at once. Decisions were being made, responses were being planned, and yet the usual signals of centralized command were not as clear as they had been in the past. For observers, analysts, and governments watching from outside, the question was no longer just about the next military move. It was about understanding who was making those moves and under what conditions. Because in a conflict like this, leadership is not just symbolic, it is operational. It shapes how quickly decisions are made, how clearly strategies are communicated, and how confidently actions are executed. When that leadership appears uncertain or obscured, even briefly, it introduces a level of unpredictability that can ripple through every layer of the system. And in those moments, perception becomes as critical as reality itself. The absence from that meeting was not just a missing presence, it was a signal, one that opened the door to a cascade of questions that are still unfolding. What followed that absence did not bring clarity. It accelerated uncertainty. Because while the leadership question remained unresolved, the battlefield itself began to change in ways that suggested something far more deliberate was unfolding beneath the surface. The next phase of the conflict was not just louder, it was more precise, more coordinated, and more revealing about the strategic intentions driving both sides. Iran's next move was not incremental. It was a calculated escalation designed to shift the nature of the confrontation. Officials confirmed the launch of a new operational wave, one that introduced capabilities that had not yet been used in this conflict. For the first time, heavier class missile systems were deployed against targets described not as military hardware, but as decision-making infrastructure. That distinction matters because it signals a change in objective. The goal was no longer simply to degrade Israel's ability to fight. It was to disrupt its ability to coordinate the fight itself. These systems carried significantly larger payloads, designed to penetrate hardened structures and inflict damage on facilities that sit at the core of command networks. Alongside them, a different category of missile was confirmed in active use, one that relies on solid fuel technology. Unlike earlier systems that require preparation time before launch, these could be fired with minimal warning. That reduced detection windows, compressed response times, and introduced a level of unpredictability that complicates even the most advanced defense systems. At the same time, the geographic scope of the conflict widened. From the north, coordinated attacks were launched by forces operating out of southern Lebanon. The timing was not random. These strikes aligned closely with the primary wave, creating a multi-directional pressure that forced defensive systems to divide their attention. Israeli sources cited in their own media acknowledged that the level of synchronization being demonstrated did not match earlier assumptions about the degraded state of these groups. Instead, what was observed was a level of operational coherence that suggested intact command structures and effective coordination. This combination, precision strikes targeting decision centers, paired with synchronized attacks from a secondary front, represents a shift from attrition to disruption. It is one thing to destroy equipment. It is another to interfere with the systems that decide how that equipment is used. By focusing on the latter, the strategy begins to affect not just immediate capabilities, but the overall efficiency of response. Communication delays, coordination breakdowns, and uncertainty within command channels can have cascading effects that extend far beyond the initial impact zones. And this is where the earlier leadership question becomes more than symbolic, because when decision-making infrastructure is under pressure, and at the same time the visibility of leadership is reduced, the two factors begin to interact. Even if operations continue, even if responses are being executed, the perception of disruption can influence how those actions are interpreted, both domestically and internationally. In high-stakes conflicts, perception can shape deterrence just as much as actual capability. While this was unfolding, the broader regional picture added another layer of complexity. Reports confirmed that strikes were not limited to Israel alone. Targets across multiple Middle Eastern countries were affected, including locations tied to logistics, energy, and military coordination. This expanded scope introduced new variables into the equation. Allies who might previously have viewed the conflict as contained were now directly experiencing its impact. That changes calculations, not just for those countries, but for the larger network of partnerships that define regional security. The economic dimension of the conflict also began to intensify. Disruptions to key shipping routes, particularly in areas critical to global energy supply, created immediate pressure on markets. Oil prices reacted sharply, reflecting both actual supply concerns and the uncertainty surrounding future developments. For countries dependent on stable energy flows, this was not an abstract issue. It was a direct economic risk, with potential domestic consequences. Inside Israel, the effects were becoming visible in daily life. Civilian routines were increasingly disrupted. Movement was restricted, businesses slowed or halted, and public services adjusted to the ongoing threat environment. Over time, these conditions do more than create inconvenience. They reshape how populations experience the conflict. Sustained disruption affects morale, influences public opinion, and can alter the political landscape in ways that are not immediately apparent, but become significant over longer periods. At the same time, the legal framework governing the country's internal operations shifted. The extension of emergency measures allowed for expanded executive authority and reduced procedural constraints. Such measures are not unusual in wartime, but they carry implications. They can streamline decision-making, but they also limit the mechanisms through which those decisions are scrutinized. In a situation where questions about leadership visibility are already circulating, this adds another dimension to how actions are perceived. Internationally, reactions were mixed. Some governments focused on the immediate security concerns, emphasizing the need to stabilize the situation and prevent further escalation. Others looked at the broader implications, particularly the potential for the conflict to draw in additional actors or to disrupt global systems beyond the region. Diplomatic channels remained active, but there was no clear indication of a pathway toward de-escalation. Each side appeared to be operating under the assumption that further pressure was necessary before any meaningful shift could occur. Back on the battlefield, the pace did not slow. Each new development seemed to build on the previous one, creating a chain reaction where actions and responses became increasingly difficult to separate. The introduction of new capabilities, the expansion of operational areas, and the ongoing uncertainty at the leadership level combined to create an environment where predictability was diminishing. And in that environment, the question was no longer just about what had happened. It was about what these patterns suggested. Because when a conflict begins to move from direct confrontation towards systemic disruption, targeting not just assets, but the structures that organize those assets, it indicates a deeper strategic shift, one that is designed not for short-term impact, but for longer-term influence over how the conflict evolves. As analysts and observers tried to piece together these developments, one thing became increasingly clear. The absence that started the conversation was not an isolated anomaly. One of the key questions emerging from this phase is whether the targeting of decision-making infrastructure is producing effects beyond immediate damage. When communication networks, coordination hubs, and intelligence processing centers are placed under pressure, the impact is not always visible in real time. Instead, it shows up in delays, in misalignment, in the subtle breakdown of processes that usually operate with speed and clarity. And in a conflict where timing can determine outcomes, even small disruptions can carry significant consequences. This is where the earlier incident involving the broadcast and the subsequent arrest begins to take on a different meaning. Because if there was even a possibility that real-time information could influence targeting decisions, it suggests that the conflict is not only being fought through conventional means, but also through the management and sometimes the exposure of information. In that context, every signal matters. Every image, every clip, every statement becomes part of a larger environment where information can shape action. Meanwhile, inside Israel, the internal pressure was becoming harder to ignore. Public sentiment, already strained by continuous disruption, began to show signs of shifting. Polling data indicated rising dissatisfaction with how the conflict was being managed. Criticism was not limited to opposition voices. It was appearing across a broader spectrum of society. In times of prolonged crisis, these shifts do not happen overnight, but when they do begin, they tend to accelerate as conditions persist. The extension of emergency measures played a critical role in this dynamic. While they allowed for more streamlined decision-making, they also reduced the usual channels through which public concerns are expressed and addressed. This creates a tension between operational efficiency and political accountability. In the short term, it can stabilize decision-making. In the longer term, it can amplify underlying dissatisfaction if the outcomes do not align with expectations. At the same time, the civilian experience of the conflict was evolving in ways that are often underestimated in strategic analysis. Living under sustained threat changes behavior. It alters routines, influences economic activity, and affects how individuals and families make decisions about their future. When schools remain closed, when businesses operate under constant uncertainty, and when movement is restricted, the cumulative effect is not just inconvenience, it is a gradual reshaping of daily life. In certain regions, particularly those closer to active front lines, this effect was even more pronounced. Reports indicated that some areas were becoming increasingly difficult to maintain as stable living environments. The combination of ongoing threat, limited access, and reduced security presence created conditions where normal life was not just disrupted, but in some cases, temporarily unsustainable. This does not require physical occupation to have an impact. The absence of normalcy itself becomes a form of pressure. From a strategic perspective, this introduces a different kind of variable, one that operates on a slower timeline, but can influence long-term outcomes. Military operations can achieve immediate objectives, but the sustainability of those outcomes often depends on the civilian environment that surrounds them. When that environment is under continuous strain, it can affect everything from economic resilience to political stability. Externally, the conflict continued to draw attention from global powers, each assessing the situation through its own strategic lens. Some viewed the escalation as a regional issue, with potential global consequences, particularly in terms of energy markets and supply chains. Others focused on the geopolitical implications, analyzing how the balance of influence in the region might shift depending on how the conflict evolves. At the same time, diplomatic efforts remained active but inconclusive. There were indications of communication channels being used to explore potential de-escalation, but no clear framework had emerged. Each side appeared to be maintaining a position that further pressure was necessary before any meaningful negotiation could take place. This creates a cycle where escalation becomes both a tactic and a signal, a way of shaping the conditions under which future discussions might occur. Amid all of this, the question of leadership visibility remained unresolved. Occasional appearances, brief statements, and indirect confirmations did little to fully address the earlier gap. When that consistency changes, it becomes part of the analysis. What has become increasingly clear is that this is no longer a limited confrontation. The pattern of escalation suggests a shift toward a conflict where restraint is becoming harder to maintain. Each side appears to be operating under a similar calculation that the cost of holding back may now be higher than the cost of pushing forward. And once that threshold is crossed, the dynamics of the conflict change in ways that are difficult to reverse. Iran's decision to deploy more advanced systems to target deeper into critical infrastructure and to coordinate across multiple fronts indicates a willingness to expand both the scale and the scope of operations. This is not just about responding to previous strikes. It is about shaping the environment in which future decisions will be made by increasing pressure on coordination systems, by widening the operational map, and by demonstrating the ability to act quickly with minimal warning. The strategy appears to be aimed at influencing not just immediate outcomes, but the broader balance of decision-making. On the other side, Israel's response has remained focused on maintaining operational momentum. Strikes have continued across multiple targets, with an emphasis on degrading capabilities and limiting the effectiveness of incoming threats. The objective, at least publicly, has been consistent: reduce the adversary's ability to sustain operations, and restore a level of deterrence that discourages further escalation. But deterrence is not static. It depends on perception, and perception is shaped by what each side believes the other is capable of and willing to do. This is where the events of the past 48 hours become especially significant, because when deterrence is tested in real time, the outcome is not determined solely by capability. It is influenced by visibility, by consistency, and by the signals that are sent through both action and communication. The absence from a critical meeting, the unconventional method of public appearance, the questions that followed. All of these factors contribute to how the situation is interpreted beyond the immediate circle of decision makers. For regional actors, these interpretations are not theoretical. They inform real decisions about alignment, involvement, and risk. Countries that might previously have stayed at the margins now face a more complex calculation. The expansion of strikes into multiple territories, the impact on energy infrastructure, and the uncertainty surrounding future developments all increase the likelihood that additional players could be drawn into the situation, whether directly or indirectly. Globally, the implications extend even further. Energy markets remain sensitive to disruptions in key transit routes, and prolonged instability in the region can have ripple effects across economies that are far removed from the conflict itself. Financial systems react not only to actual supply changes, but to the expectation of future instability. In that sense, the conflict is already influencing conditions well beyond its geographic boundaries. At the same time, internal pressures within the countries directly involved continue to build. In Israel, the combination of sustained disruption, economic strain, and evolving public sentiment creates a complex domestic environment. Emergency measures may provide short-term flexibility, but they do not eliminate the underlying dynamics that shape political stability. Over time, those dynamics tend to reassert themselves, especially if the situation does not show clear signs of resolution. And yet, despite all of this movement, one element remains unchanged. There is still no clearly defined endpoint. Neither side has publicly outlined conditions under which it would consider the conflict concluded. Without that clarity, each new action becomes part of an open-ended sequence where escalation is easier to initiate than to contain. This is the point where analysis becomes less about prediction and more about understanding possibilities. Because when a conflict reaches this level of complexity, outcomes are rarely determined by a single decision or a single event. They emerge from the interaction of multiple factors: military capability, political will, public perception, and international response, all influencing each other in real time. One possible path is continued escalation, where each side pushes further in an attempt to force a shift in the other's position. Another is a gradual move toward de-escalation, driven not by agreement, but by the recognition that the costs are becoming unsustainable. A third possibility lies somewhere in between, a prolonged period of instability where neither side fully escalates nor fully steps back, resulting in an ongoing state of tension that reshapes the region over time. What makes this moment particularly significant is that the signals pointing toward each of these paths are all present at once. Escalation is visible in the deployment of new capabilities and the expansion of targets. Pressure toward de-escalation can be seen in the economic and political costs that are beginning to accumulate. And the conditions for a prolonged standoff are evident in the lack of a defined endpoint and the persistence of underlying tensions. In the middle of all this, the question that started it all, about leadership visibility, remains part of the broader picture. Not because it alone determines the outcome, but because it reflects a deeper issue: how information is managed, how signals are interpreted, and how perception shapes reality in high-stakes environments. In conflicts like this, what is seen, what is said, and what is left unexplained can carry as much weight as the actions themselves. The reality is that the first casualty in any war is clarity. Information becomes contested, narratives compete, and certainty becomes harder to maintain. But that does not make analysis less important. It makes it more necessary, because understanding the difference between what is confirmed, what is assumed, and what remains unknown is the only way to navigate a situation where the stakes continue to rise. As this conflict moves forward, every new development will add another layer to the story. Some questions will be answered, others will be replaced by new ones, and the picture that emerges will not be static. It will continue to evolve as each side adjusts its strategy, its messaging, and its expectations. So the question now is not just what has happened, but what happens next. Because in a situation where escalation has become the default, where uncertainty is part of the environment, and where the consequences extend far beyond the immediate battlefield, the next move may not just shape the outcome of the conflict, it may define the future of the region itself.